So I want to welcome you all to this session, which will be focusing on creating structure and engagement in virtual meetings. My name is Stephen Catania. I'm the online training coordinator in the Office of Human Resources at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We only have a short while together today, and before we jump into the content of the material about virtual meetings, I want to just take a note to acknowledge that I'm sure that for people on this webinar, virtual meetings are not the biggest thing on their mind. There are much weightier and more important things going on in the world right now. And as we're all trying to figure out a collective way that we can move forward in addressing the wrongs that are taking place in the world, some people may be struggling with what to do next. So I want to include just a few resource links here in the chat for those who are unsure of what they can do, but are looking for opportunities to get involved, to figure out what they can do to make a difference in what's going on in the world. As we get into the material itself here, I want to just give you a really brief overview of what we'll be talking about for the next 30 minutes. And here's a brief agenda that lays out the information. As you can see, it's broken down under the topics, time, and the lead. And this is just one example of what an agenda will look like. But as we'll talk a little bit later, having an agenda in a virtual meeting is actually a really helpful way to address some of these engagement and structural issues that exist. The idea of technical considerations is usually at the forefront of virtual meetings. And it's not something that I would spend a great deal of time on right now, because everyone's needs are going to be a little bit different based on what they want their virtual meeting to be. So one of the things that I want to just make really clear to everyone is that there are some helpful resources available to those on campus and for even those who are not on campus that can help them figure out which tool is going to be best for them. Here in the chat is a link to a knowledge base article which lays out all the different virtual meeting options that are available to members of the UW-Madison community. If you are not a member of the UW-Madison community, those tools may not be available to you, but this does provide a really nice breakdown of the pros and the cons of the tools, and they help you decide which one is going to best meet your needs. One of the other technical considerations, and as I look to see where we're at right now, I see that there's 43 of us on this call, is that when you're doing virtual meetings, some people may not have reliable internet, and this can create a problem. So the second resource that I want to share with you is a map of free Wi-Fi locations that are available across the state of Wisconsin. If you check out this map, it is frequently updated. It provides locations for where people can go to find reliable, high-speed Wi-Fi, which may allow them to be more engaged in the virtual meetings. The last comment that I want to make about technical considerations is that whichever tool you use, the most important thing is that you need to practice. Going into your virtual meeting or your virtual presentation for the first time using that tool is not the best way to handle that situation. You'll want to spend time beforehand understanding the tool, understanding its quirks and its issues, so that when a problem arises during the session, and a problem will arise during a session, I would love to say that that never happens, but it almost always does, that when those situations arise, because you've practiced with the tool already, you understand how best to address that issue. Continually move forward and keep the meeting moving without letting the technology create problems. I see that people are continuing to type into the chat. I encourage you to keep doing so. I want to make a note that as I'm seeing questions come in, I'll do my best to answer it in the moment if it ties really closely into the topic. And I also want to let people know that we will have 10 minutes at the end of this session, which is really set aside specifically for a group discussion and for answering those problems that you're all laying out in the questions that you're sharing. So we will get to as many of those questions as we can later on in this session. I want to turn our attention now to meeting structures. As you've seen on the screen here for a little bit, as well as hopefully in some of your own meetings, having an agenda is a really important part of providing structure within a meeting. My recommendations are that when you have an agenda, that you send it out in advance of the meeting. This will allow people in a meeting to have a sense of who's going to be leading a conversation on a topic, who is going to be responsible for engaging in a dialogue about that material, as well as how much time is going to be dedicated to that topic. Virtual meetings, similar to a face-to-face meeting, can very quickly get out of hand. Having an agenda that is sent out in advance so that everyone knows what's going to take place in a meeting will allow you to maximize the time that you're virtually with one another so that you're able to accomplish the most. The second part of a meeting structure that I think will be helpful is having a dedicated note taker. In a virtual meeting, this is especially important because people's technology may not be allowing them to connect. People have discussed having audio issues where there's a delay or there's a lag, or people might not have that reliable internet connection and they keep getting kicked out of a meeting. By having a note taker, you're ensuring that everyone, those who are in attendance but keep getting disconnected, or those who are listening, paying attention, but have a question later on, can come back, review what was discussed during the meeting to make sure that they are fully aware of what was being said. A recommendation about having a note taker is that this is something that you are going to assign in advance, and you should pass it around so it's not one person taking notes every time. It is difficult to take notes and be engaged fully with a meeting, so it's nice to be able to pass that responsibility along so that it never falls as a burden on only one person in the meeting. The third part about meeting structures I want to discuss is the idea of having a facilitator and, particularly for virtual meetings, a producer. A facilitator is a little bit different than the person leading an item on the agenda. The facilitator is the person who's keeping track of time, who is helping make sure that all those topics on the agenda are getting addressed and that no one topic is bogging down the entire meeting. So that facilitator is someone whose specific role is set out to make sure that the meeting is effective, to help it move along, and to intercede when there's moments to say, that's a really good point. I think we should put that on the parking lot and we can come back to it to discuss that at a different meeting. Or that's a really good point. It's been noted down in the notes. Let's keep moving along so that we're able to keep the momentum going on this topic. The role of a producer is a little bit different than the facilitator. And what we see going on in this session today is actually a perfect example of having a producer. Right now, I'm talking with you, but behind the scenes, a number of my colleagues are helping produce this. They're responding to people who are having technical issues. They're responding to individual chat messages. They're making sure that the technology works and that I'm able to focus on having a conversation with you and not having to troubleshoot individual issues that people are having. So if you are able to have someone who serves as that producer role, it's a very helpful way to help the meeting maintain its structure rather than having it get derailed when technology isn't working correctly. And this goes along with what I mentioned before about that idea of really taking the time to practice with the tool in advance. If your team as a whole wants to practice with that tool, that way everyone has experience and that anyone can step in to be the producer as needed. And it's not just one person time and time again who has to serve that role. Another part about meetings that can help provide structure is having working agreements. These are something that you would hopefully have in a face-to-face meeting, and it becomes especially important in virtual meetings. Agreements or community understandings are where all those people who are in attendance at the meeting come together to set out their expectations for one another and that meeting. An example of a meeting agreement may be that we're not going to multitask. It's a virtual meeting, we're all in front of our computers. It's really easy to pop over and respond to that important email that just came in through Outlook. Or it may seem important at the time, but your attention has already diverted away from the meeting because you've clicked over to Outlook. Having those agreements in advance will allow you to have better structure in your meetings. Another idea that goes along with these agreements may be a conversation about when is someone going to be muted, when is someone going to have their camera on. These are conversations that you want to have collectively so that people are comfortable and that you're all on the same page with these fundamentals of meeting structures. Another important component to meeting structure is that meetings, especially virtual meetings, should be about discussion and dialogue. If you are simply sharing out information or if you are simply presenting information without any room for discussion, I would challenge you to ask whether or not that needs to be a meeting or if this is something that can be shared out in a different way. If it's simply an update to your team, maybe this is information that can be communicated via an email. If it's a presentation, share that presentation in advance so that when you come together to have that virtual meeting, you're having a discussion. You're providing feedback on the topics that were discussed in that presentation. You really want to maximize having people together in a meeting so that you're talking, you're discussing, you're clarifying those ideas, rather than having it be a very passive situation in which one person is talking and everyone else is sitting there unable to make any contributions. The last thing I want to discuss in terms of meeting structure is that even though we're virtual, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have breaks. Meetings, as they get longer, you need to include breaks. People may need to use the restroom. People may need to check an email. So as part of those community agreements that we talked about a moment ago, this could be an opportunity. Hey, don't check your emails during the meeting. We're going to have a break after 40 minutes. You can check emails then. You can go to the restroom. You can do what you want. So just make it very clear to those people. You can include it in the agenda that there will be breaks as part of meetings as a way to help people stay focused, stay engaged, and also take care of themselves as they need to. One thing before we shift into the idea of engagement activities and engagement practices for meetings is I want to share this poll. So from the structural strategies that we've just discussed, if you want to put in the chat A, B, C, D, E, F, G, which one of these are you most interested in trying at your next virtual meeting? I'll give you just a short while here to respond. I want to see what people are thinking. This is another one of those nice opportunities where having a producer, someone behind the scenes taking care of chat is really helpful so that I'm not having to pause to look through all of these things and all of these responses that you're including. My colleague producers on the back end will be able to share with us which ones people are most interested in taking forward to their next virtual meeting. And I appreciate you all sharing. As we shift our thoughts over to engagement activities, one of the first things that I want to share with you is this idea of having a snapshot. This is taking the pulse or a poll, what we just saw, of gauging where people are at in the meeting, what they're feeling, what they're thinking. You can ask this similar to what we did right now. It doesn't need to require any fancy technology. Of just asking people, what did you think of that topic? Are you ready to move on? Do you have more questions? Where are you at in your headspace as you come to this meeting? You can have them at the start, you can have them during the middle, you can have them at the end. But really taking this time to engage and check the pulse, or to take the snapshot of where the people in the virtual meeting feel and are thinking at the time. Because you don't have all the visual cues that you would in a face-to-face meeting, you have to get creative in finding ways to engage with the people in the meeting, and doing these short polls or asking these short check-in questions is one way to help achieve that. A second component to having engagement in your meetings, and I understand that for some of you, your meetings may only have 3 or 4 people, and for others of you, you may have 75 people or more showing up in your meetings. In either of those situations, making sure to use names is a really important way to have engagement, especially as you get into larger meetings where people aren't able to have their cameras on due to bandwidth issues. Taking the time to say, this is Steve, and here's my thought, taking that time to include your name to help express your thoughts and your ideas is really helpful for helping keep other people engaged. And there's also the component of, within virtual meetings, to help that engagement level, you may call someone out by name to ask them if they have any questions. This can help alleviate some of those pregnant silences that people had mentioned, or some of those awkward pauses. Now, my recommendation for you is that when you have your working agreements as a meeting, you discuss this issue. Some people are vehemently opposed to asking people a question on the spot. So by including someone's name and having this discussion in advance, you're working with your team to make sure that this is an okay practice, or talk through why this isn't going to work for some people. As someone who takes time to form their thoughts, I struggle in meetings to respond on the fly to a question. So one of the things that, as part of the working agreements I've had with teams, is we do our best to send questions out in advance so that I have time to think about something, and then in a meeting, when someone calls me out by name, I've already know what questions they're going to be asking about, so that I am then able to have a better response and I'm not feeling like I'm overwhelmed by the situation. So include names both when you're speaking as well as when you're trying to get feedback from your audience. A third option is raising your hands. Pretty much all of the virtual tools have this option where you can raise your hand as a way to take that snapshot and get people's quick engagement. I could say, how many of you are ready to move on to the next topic? And people could raise their hands. Or you could also have an opportunity to say, because you don't know and don't want to speak over someone, raise your hand when you want to share something. That way the facilitator is able to call on people by saying, okay, I saw that so-and-so had their name, or excuse me, so-and-so had their hand raised. They'll be the next person to speak on this. It can help get away from the awkward silences and keep the meeting moving along. Another component to engagement is video. And this is a very heavy discussion in some regards, because for some people, having their video on is not something they're able to do. As we look at video, and Renisha, I see that you have a question here about what the difference is between a meeting and a training. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. So I do see your question, and we will get to that. With videos, you want to have these conversations with the people who are going to be on your meetings of when you should have a video on and when you shouldn't have a video on. Due to technology considerations or bandwidth with the internet, some people are unable to have their videos turned on, and that limits the amount of feedback that you're able to get. One encouragement I would give you is that depending on what you feel the needs are for videos in your meetings, this should be a discussion that you have with your team, and explain really clearly why it is that you, as either the facilitator or a member of the meeting, would like to have people's videos on. By making the why really clear, this can help remove any sort of sticking points that there might be about whether or not someone feels comfortable having their video on. If you are presenting a topic and you are discussing with one another and you really want to see facial expressions or you want to see body language, making that clear to the other people in the meeting for why they should have or why you'd like them to have their video on can go a long way towards helping keep the engagement in the meeting. In the case of not being able to have your video on, you would like to at least have your photo uploaded to whichever virtual platform you're using as a way to provide some level of engagement, so it's not just a blank name or a blank silhouette staring back at the person when you're talking. The last part of engagement I want to discuss is using small groups. Even though we're in virtual meetings, a lot of the tools have the option to break people up into smaller groups. Remember what I said before, that virtual meetings should be about discussion and collaboration and dialogue. You want to talk with one another. And sometimes you can't do that all as a large group, depending on how many people are involved in a meeting. So leverage your options to have small group discussions. Say 3 or 4 people are going to talk about this topic, 3 or 4 other people are going to talk about this different topic, and then send them into these smaller groups. Leverage the technology so that you're able to have these discussions, so that when you're all able to come back as a large group, you're not rehashing the same thing over and over, but instead you're bringing new ideas, new points of conversation that occurred in those small group settings. So I want to give us some time now here at the end to answer some of these questions that have been coming in the chat, as well as some of the private messages that have been coming in. So if you have questions about what we've discussed so far and you haven't already typed your question into the chat, please feel free to do so. Rodisha, I want to answer your question right now, as it's right in front of me, of what the difference is between a meeting and a training. A meeting is much more of everyone is engaged in dialogue. You are all here for a singular purpose of talking about the items that are listed out on an agenda. And a training is much more of you are here to learn about a new topic by one or multiple people who are deemed as sort of the instructors or the trainers. I don't want to say that a training shouldn't be interactive and engagement, and I know that we have some people on the webinar here with us today who do those trainings and make them very engaged and interactive. But usually the difference between a meeting and a training is that in a meeting, everyone from the beginning is there to have dialogue and communication. And within a training, there's usually 1 or 2 people who are leading that training and engaging with the audience to make sure that they learn about that new topic that's very specifically focused on some new material. I want to pop over to see some of the other questions that have been coming in. And my producer colleagues have been very kind in breaking them down into categories for me. The idea of the engagement has come up a lot, and really struggling sort of with this silence and the inability to read the room. So one of the things that I would recommend and encourage people to do is to have those discussions with your team and the people who are going to be in that virtual meeting about how they view engagement and what practices are going to work best for all of you. This is a really important idea, is that you don't want an engagement practice that you think is very beneficial to make someone else in that meeting feel like they're under the spotlight, or to shut down and disengage. So having those community agreements and having those discussions in advance, you can very well have a meeting dedicated to just setting out those agreements, so that for all future meetings, you're all already aware of what you want to do with each other as ways to help the engagement take place. I see questions coming in about different technology platforms and how to raise hands in Microsoft Teams. Matt, I see that you just asked that question. Microsoft Teams just recently rolled out a new update that includes the hand raising option. It is mostly rolled out across campus. It's possible you don't have that yet, but if you were in Microsoft Teams, you'll see a hand icon right next to where you see your mute and video buttons. Some other questions that people have asked about. What to do about the lack of feedback? Depending on the platform that you're using, or really any of the platforms that you want to use, one of the things that I can recommend you do is either use emoticons. So in this case, Blackboard has a lot of different emoticons. You can ask people to use certain emoticons to express how they're feeling about a topic or what they're thinking in that moment. It could be asking them whether or not they're ready to move on to the next topic, give a thumbs up, or use that raise hand option as a way to really help the person who's leading that session on the agenda know that there are more questions. They aren't ready to hand it off to the next person on the agenda. So I keep sort of coming back to this point of you need to have these conversations with your team for what you want to agree on is going to work best for you. I know that for some of the meetings that I've been in, it's been very clear that you will only use the hand raise icon, or you will only use the smiley face icon or the thumbs up icon. And that's limiting in the amount of feedback that you're able to get, but it is at least something that you're able to provide in that moment. Similar to what you would have in a face-to-face meeting, one of the things I would encourage you to do in your virtual meetings as well is to make sure that you have sort of to-do or next steps at the end of that meeting. Make sure it's really clear in the notes what you're going to do as your action items. Here's what we discussed in the meeting, here's what we're going to do next, and if needed, the people who are responsible for steering those items or those next step actions. So you'll want to follow up with people on your virtual meetings to make sure that people are feeling engaged, making sure that they're having their voice heard. If you've gone through a number of these practices and you're finding that people still aren't engaging, reach out to them after the fact. Ask them if there's something that they feel is missing from that meeting that is allowing them to not engage fully. So please don't think that the virtual meeting is the only time you should be having these conversations with one another about what works best. And one of the things that you can do is ask people about other virtual meetings that they've been on. Ask them what's worked well for them in those meetings and see if those are any practices that you can take back to your own team for its own virtual meetings. I see a question just came in here about how long to allow for silences before moving on. I wish I could give you a sort of set number. I will say that in a virtual space, I find that you need to give a little bit longer than you do in a face-to-face environment because people don't have that body language. They're not seeing someone's mouth start to form words as someone else is finishing up their thought. You do need to allow a little bit more space for those silences in virtual meetings. And again, that's something that you might be able to have as a team agreement saying, we're always going to have 10 seconds of silence after any question. So that way people aren't saying, okay, I'm going to wait 15 seconds before I speak up. You've come up with an agreement as a team, and so you're going to apply that across all your meetings. Samantha, I do have some recommendations about WebEx, but we're just about out of time. If you want to stay on at the end of this session, I'll be happy to talk with you a bit more about those. We are wrapping up here in our time, and I want to be respectful for all of those who have joined us here today. Thank you very much for attending. There's a couple of things I want to share with you as we end up. I know a number of questions have come in, and I wasn't able to answer all of them. Please feel free to reach out to me by email. It's listed here, oddly enough, with the U broken onto its second line, but it's steven.catania@wisc.edu. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'll be happy to answer your questions as best I can. I also want to share some resources that are going to be available to people, some who are UW-Madison folks and some who are not. One of those is going to be a 90-minute session by a colleague of mine, Teresa Kim, that's dedicated really to this topic, how to have effective and engaged meetings. It's a 90-minute session. Jenna just shared a link to that in the chat. So if you're a UW-Madison employee, I recommend you take a look at it. It will have the opportunity to dive deeper into a number of the points that we've discussed today and go into more depth, and also show some of the capabilities of the tools to have things like breakout rooms and smaller group discussions. There's also a couple of resources that are here. One is a LinkedIn Learning course, and another is just a Harvard Business Review article about virtual meetings. So please take a look at those resources. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions as well. So thank you very much for joining us today.